If y'all can see my screen. Beautiful. Let's get started. There's a lot to cover today. So, quick context on who I am. I'm an open book, so I'll give you the elevator pitch. I grew up on the East Coast, played tennis in college, did strategy consulting for a while in the investment space, and then went to business school. I went to University of North Carolina. If you're anything like a college basketball fan, this is a big time of month for us with March Madness, so entertaining to kind of watch that. So when I was at UNC, I started to transition more into GM/marketing roles. So after UNC, I went to Coca-Cola, was on the brand team at Diet Coke, was a blast, second largest beverage brand in the world behind Coca-Cola. So it was fun to be there and see marketing at scale, and really an emphasis on consumer insights and brand work in particular. And then after there, I got an itch to want to do something in sport. Adidas gave me an opportunity to be the first hire onto a new division that they were standing up and scaling. So was GM of the college business, oversaw all things marketing, did everything under the sun as it relates to the marketing stack from creative work, brand work, digital work, positioning, identity frameworks, etc. And one of the main things, and this is like the impetus of the conversation today, one of the main things that kept coming up at the Adidas work in particular, and has been consistent throughout my work at this point, is around brand identity and brand positioning and messaging and tone. Think of today's session as like one of many that we'll start to unpack together because I love putting this stuff together and kind of sharing that experience. So I was at Adidas for a while, and then I moved into the startup space. Was head of growth at a startup down in Mountain View called KiwiCo, then transitioned into a head of marketing CMO/GM role at a Web3 company. And then almost 3 years ago, today at this point, I had stood up my own company called Parish Ventures, where essentially I serve as a fractional head of marketing for startups, really stage agnostic, industry agnostic at this point. One of my clients' video sites has been incredible. I've worked with them for a handful of years, and I'm very embedded in the business. And that is a little bit about Paris Ventures, but also how I got to where I'm at today and kind of teeing up the conversation that we'll dive into. So the first topic I wanted to dive into for our series was all around the power of visual identity. So think of this as anything that a consumer or partner sees that you put together, that is technically considered visual identity. So one of the things that when I first start working with founders, whether it's 5 years ago, 2 years ago, even some of the folks who I help with on the side today, there's a very common thematic of things that come up. One is around like brand foundation. So think of this as almost creating a workbook of sorts of who you are, what you stand for, etc. That includes your mission statement, your vision statement, core values, etc. Defining who you are as an audience and why you are different. The second thing, and all these are related to one another, so they should be tackled in unison, but I'm going to cover one of these topics in particular today. The second one is around brand personality and voice. Depending upon what type of company you are, your character to the audience should be different, and how you talk to the audience should be different. So I always think of this as like if you're building a player profile on a video game, like what attributes do you want to heavy up on, and which ones do you want to be light on? Do you want to be playful and fun and kind of very witty in your tone and voice, or do you want to be super professional if you're selling into a Salesforce or a Google of sorts, where the tone is going to need to be a different tone, right? And the words you use should be different as well. And then the third piece, and this comes up with everybody who I talk to who has started a company, regardless of stage, whether they just started last week or whether they're 10 years into the business, is all around visual identity. So think of visual identity as the face of your brand. It is all things design oriented. It's your logo, it's your color palette, it's your typography, it's your icon sets, it's your graphic packages. Everything that you do from a design standpoint around the brand is technically considered visual identity work. So that since that is a very common thing that I get from folks, that's where I wanted to start our kind of chapter and series of content today. So let's dive into visual identity in particular. So first, I think it's important to set the stage as to like why does visual identity matter? And there's really a couple things. One, it's around recognition and recall. Two, and a lot of people overlook this piece, is around creating an emotional connection with the audience who you're looking to serve and deliver for. Three is around differentiation in the marketplace, making sure that you don't look like something that was taken right off the shelf. And then four is around ultimately supporting like brand trust and credibility. So we're going to unpack some of these. And there's five primary elements of a visual identity and kind of brand identity system. So think of this as first, it starts with your logo. That is your primary mark. We'll unpack all the different types of logos that are out there. So you have more knowledge of kind of the set that you could be selecting from and should be evaluating as it relates to your own company. Two is around color palette. Colors can make somebody feel a very certain type of way. So you should be very thoughtful in your color selection. A color like red is going to give a very different feeling to a consumer than the color of black. So being very thoughtful and mindful as to when you use those colors and when you don't use those colors should be incorporated across companies of all stages. The third one is around typography, and we'll unpack this is think of this as the different font families that you're using. A lot of folks will be very liberal with the different font families that they're using. You should be very consistent with the font families that you're using. So for example, if you select a serif font early on in your company's history and you have a brand identity system, the serif font should be used throughout. And there's so many different variations of serif font that you can find the thing that's unique for your brand and then own that, but there should be a system in place for doing so. The fourth piece of visual identity, and we'll unpack this here in a second, is around imagery and graphics. So think of this as your identity in a visual set of sorts. We'll unpack what that means. And then these first four things all ladder into a design system. And I'll show you an example of one that we built for a friend of mine who had just started a company and had a rough primary mark, but still wanted some touches on his primary mark, and then a system built around it. So then anytime that he is working with somebody who's being onboarded internally, anytime he's working with a vendor that he's onboarding to help support anything from website design to one-pager creation to collateral for LinkedIn assets, whatever it may be, there is a system in place that essentially builds the sandbox that allows everybody to operate within the guidelines that you set as a brand. Marian, I'll pause right there for a second. I don't see the questions on my side, but are there any questions that I should be answering before I go any further?
I don't see any question, but usually we can leave like the questions till the end.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. Great. So let's unpack each of these five that I shared before, starting with the logo in particular. The way I think about logos is kind of this tagline to the key characteristics is that they should be unique. Like they should be a true one of one, not something that's going to be grabbed off the shelf. It should be incredibly memorable, not only for you, not only for your employees, but also ultimately those in the audiences who you're looking to serve. It should be very versatile as well. I think a lot of people miss these last two pieces around like versatility and scalability. Is take, for example, you're presenting at a conference and you need to put this on a screen that's 50 feet by 100 feet, right? Does your logo expand nicely to kind of fit that type of set atmosphere and environment for you to be able to make sure your logo set is malleable to the different platforms that you're playing in? So there are five primary different types of logos. There's a couple subcategories to these. I'm happy to drill into y'all further if of interest. But the five are a word mark. So think of this like Google, right? Google is literally using its word and its logo, and for the most part, doesn't have any icon sets around it. The second is a letter mark. So IBM, right? It abbreviated its company name and essentially structured it as a acronym of sorts. The third is an icon symbol. As somebody who worked at Adidas, it was painful for me to put a Nike logo on here, but I had to because their logo is so iconic. Is Nike is an icon and a symbol, but It is also a combination mark, which you'll see in the mark on the bottom left, where they're essentially taking their icon symbol and placing it underneath of their word mark, right? And then the last one here is around an emblem. So think of this as a Starbucks, right? They're creating a image and then they're placing it in a container and then they're putting their word mark structured around that retainer. So a lot of best practices that, and I'll make sure to show these on each of the slides that we share. A lot of the best practices that I share with folks in my community is one, just like keep it timeless. Something that you're good to keep for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And you can always tweak and kind of make edits around the margins. But something that you feel good is going to stand the test of time. Two is around how legible is it? So around here, a lot of folks that I see have really uniquely designed marks, but they're very difficult to read, right? And you need to capture an eye within 30 seconds when somebody's kind of seeing your respective mark. So legibility is a key aspect there. And then is it malleable, right? This was my point earlier around think about where your primary mark is going to live and how it is going to show up in those environments and those locations. From your website to your decks to events that you may be sponsoring to things that you may be printing out as well, right? Say it's a bumper sticker, for example, right? You need to be thinking about all the different placements of your logo and how your respective logo and brand mark is going to fit into those placements. The second piece I want to cover is around like the psychology of color. I think this is often overlooked when it relates to marketing and design is how color makes people feel. Obviously, I have a very set identity system and colors that I use for Paris Ventures that give off a certain type of feeling. But I feel that a lot of founders who I work with and have worked with in the past often overlook the power of this and the feelings that it can create for the audiences who you're ultimately kind of pitching into. So the primary ones in particular here, I have 6 standard ones, and then I had a unique one with teal. But red is something that you're going to use when you want something very high energy and high passion, right? Blue to the right of it symbols trust and professionalism. Blue, you will see, is often used for insurance companies, for example, and insurtech companies, and for their policy holders. Black, moving down here to the second row, is around power, right? So this is the classic Nike logo. Green to the right of it is typically used anytime you want to talk about growth and or sustainability. I saw over probably the last 5, 10 years, it felt like green was being almost only used for sustainability oriented things. But now you're starting to see more green in the market because people are denoting it with the feeling of growth. Yellow, think of this as like classic McDonald's logo. This is optimism. This is growth. This is like fun, kind of whimsical use of color. There is a problem with yellow, though, is that it is very difficult to read in a lot of different placements. So be very mindful of the use of yellow and the different shades of yellow that you could be using. The next one is around orange. Orange is totally playful, super high enthusiasm. Think of this as Fanta. Fanta carries this over across all their respective brands as well. I saw it firsthand when I was working there at Coke. And then a unique one that I wanted to add in here is something like teal, right? Like there are offset colors, like non-primary colors that could be really interesting to use that give a certain type of feeling like teal, which is around elegance and being exclusive. So the best practices that I have here is you need to really set a primary and secondary color palette. You need to ensure accessibility. And this is getting to the piece around yellow. Like yellow can be very difficult to read depending upon the types of collateral or design orientation work that you're doing. And then the main piece here is just around the consistency across all brand materials and using the color hierarchy that you set up. And I'll show you an example of a brand identity system if we have time at the end that helps set that. The next one is around typography. So this is like your choice of font. I call it the brand's voice and type. It essentially communicates your personality and tone. Because as basic as it may seem, this will give people a feeling as to who you are as a brand without you naturally potentially talking to these folks. So some of the most common font types that you see in font categories that you see are font types like serif. This is like your classic, trustworthy uh, font type. You see it pretty much in every email provider too. Like Google has a serif font, Microsoft has a serif font. Like this, you will find everywhere. It's almost like your Times New Roman as well. But a rendition of serif that you see pretty frequently as well is sans serif. This is a more modern version. You can see it's less heavily weighted than serif. And what I mean by weight is think of this as like the depthness of the color that you see in serif. It's really thick, whereas sans serif is less thick, so it's less weighted, probably easier to read as well. And then you can move to more of a elegant creative font family, like a script, right? Script can be tough to be legible in all environments, but if you are working in more of a sales collateral environment and less of like you're putting this on a big screen and whatnot, script fonts work great, right? They're super elegant, feels like very premium. And you can also get very creative with these too, because the swoops and the letter, for example, a great designer could have a field day with those. And then the last one, which I typically honestly use a lot as well, is a font like display. So this is super bold. It's very attention grabbing. What you see is it's very dense. It's very heavily weighted. It's not going to work in all environments though, and you need to be very mindful of the placements as to where you're putting this. But these are four very, very like broad font categories that I always share with folks that you should be thinking about which of these lanes that you want to kind of dig into. And then once you do dig into these lanes, there are hundreds of fonts that sit under each of these categories. So think about the ones that are going to be work best for you and your brand, and something to be mindful of the fonts because I work with this on the daily with one of my main company, like my main company is does that font download to certain file types and carry its consistency, right? So take, for example, you're building a slide deck and you're using a font like Poppins, for example, which is very like bubbly font. Poppins doesn't always download to a PDF very nicely. So that then creates issues when you're working with internal teams and you're setting them up with collateral, and then ultimately they're needing to download it as a PDF and send to clients. There will forever be formatting issues when you're working with Poppins and slides and going to PDF. So like these are things that you need to be thinking about and testing when thinking about the different font families and font types that you want to choose. But ultimately, the best practice here as well is like you should be choosing 1 to 2 primary fonts, and you should be ensuring readability across all platforms and all file types as well. The next piece I got here is around like imagery and graphics. So this is like figuring out what is the role of photography, what is the role of icon sets, what is the role of illustrations, and what does that mean for your brand? I have a lot of visuals on this in the example that I'll be sharing here in a second to bring this to life. But think of this as like visual storytelling, right? Photography is the assets that you're capturing, right? Like say if you're doing a photo shoot or you're just grabbing assets from Getty images or even creating off AI tools like Midjourney at this point, what is the photography feel that you want to give? Is it real people in those assets? Is it something that's less realism, right? That is more graphic oriented and almost like hand drawn, for example. So that's photography, and I'll show you examples of that here in a second. The next one is around icon sets. Icon sets are incredible because they help simplify very complex things. It also helps improve navigation. So think of this as you're building a website or you're building a digital product, a web or mobile app, whatever it may be. Icon sets are incredibly helpful in helping kind of groom the user to navigate through these very complex environments and a very design-oriented intuition as well. And then the last one is around illustration. I feel like this has become more and more of a thing in probably the last 5 years is designers and brand-oriented folks like drawing unique assets for their respective brand. Almost think of this as like doodles, for example, right? Like people are drawing these doodles and then they're turning them into icons at this point. But the thing I love about these, and it's hard to scale these for what it's worth, because a lot of them are hand drawn, although some of the AI tools are definitely helping with that. But it adds personality and it helps explain complex ideas, very similar to icon sets, in a very engaging way. So those are the things to be mindful of as it relates to imagery and graphics. But the key best practice here is like keep a very consistent visual tone and make sure that everything that you're doing as it relates to photography, icon sets, illustration, like all aligns with the broader brand values, which we can unpack in the next conversation around like brand positioning, workbooks, etc. It just all needs to align there. The next thing, and this was like the number five on the list that I showed you that I wanted to run through today in a very like quick manner is all this is great, but it needs to be put into a very cohesive design system. And when I'll show you the example here that I have on the screen is I have the Figma file to my right that I'm happy to walk you through what a real brand guidelines deck looks like. One of my friends created this product development agency, and he had a rough logo that he was working with, but he didn't have his primary mark completely set, and he didn't have an identity system to support that primary mark. And he was starting to run into issues because any internal person that he was onboarding, any vendor that he was working with, the first thing that they were asking for was for his brand identity system. So take, for example, this company, Geo, my buddy Zach wanted to create a very large website. The first thing that the website agency asked for was his identity toolkit. So they would know the constraints for which they should start building creatively for the website. So identity systems and these design systems are incredible as you scale up your marketing teams. They're incredible for all your external vendors. They're even incredible for partners too. So if you're doing a lot of partnership work, it's one of the things that you should be sharing with your respective partners so that they're adhering to your brand guidelines whenever y'all are doing stuff together. One of the last couple slides that I wanted to share is just like common mistakes that I see in the marketplace as it relates to visual identity. First one is just around inconsistency. And this actually goes along with number five as well, too, is inconsistency plus a lack of discipline can really cause problems in the marketplace when you're not showing up the same across every single touch point that you may have with consumers, from LinkedIn to your social to your digital channels to your website to your sales collateral. Like everything should feel exactly the same. It should feel very cohesive and unified with one another. The second common mistake that I see is around scalability, right? So this is you taking your graphic packages or you taking your primary marks or you taking your icon sets and expanding them or contrasting them in size and making sure that they still have their integrity. You should be pressure testing all those things in your icon sets and your graphic assets and your primary marks to make sure that depending upon the placement of those things, that they show up in the way that you intended them to show up. The third thing I see, and I see this a lot mostly with early stage friends and founders, is around the use of generic stock imagery. There are so many alternatives to stock imagery at this point in time, and that you should be leaning into. It doesn't always need to be you going out and doing a photo shoot, because like that can cost an extreme amount of money, pending your budget. But there are definitely sites out there that have more unique stock imagery. And yes, a lot of it's around a paywall, but the AI tools that are coming out today, Midjourney is by far my favorite. I have myself use it, I have my teams use it. Um, it really helps create unique assets that you can be peppering across the different locations and placements that you need to. The fourth one that I see all too common is just overcomplicated designs. So this is almost getting uh, thinking less scalable in terms of what you're building and the use of colors, almost having too many colors, fonts having too many fonts, graphic packages having 30 graphic packages instead of probably like 5 to 10 very, very good graphic packages. But I see overcomplication of these design systems all the time. So I'd advise always keep it simple to start, and then you can always expand upon it as you start to use it more often. And then the fifth one that I hinted upon earlier, and maybe this is because like I'm very type A and like a lack of discipline with design systems is a huge issue I see pretty much across every brand. And every brand, regardless of size, faces this as they scale, right? Because you need to essentially control how your brand is being represented in the marketplace, and design systems do that exact thing, and making sure that you have the sandbox built in order to make sure that everybody is building appropriately within the sandbox. So one of the things that I wanted to leave y'all with, I'm just checking time here, wanted to leave y'all with is like, all this is great, but like, what can you actually do as a founder, regardless of stage, regardless of industry, as you think about brand identity work? One is just conducting an audit of your existing brand assets. Some folks already have a very good version one of a brand identity system, but there are ways to level it up. And then some folks, depending upon your stage, like may not have anything. So then it's starting to just do a complete audit of how are you currently showing up in the marketplace, the fonts, the icons, the primary marks, etc., and refreshing a lot of those things and starting to put structure around a lot of those things, which goes into my second piece, is starting to develop and document your brand guidelines. So this is how your primary mark should be used, how different fonts should be used, how different graphic packages should be used, etc. So that you as a founder, you and your marketing stacks and really product stack at this point have a kind of sandbox to play in, and any vendor or partner that you work with does as well. And then the third one, and this gets back to my point around discipline, is really making sure you apply that visual identity consistently across platforms. Because the way that you show up matters across every one of these, because all your audiences and all your consumers are not a single channel audience or a single channel consumer. They're seeing you on LinkedIn, they're seeing you on your website, they're seeing you in your sales collateral, they're seeing you at events. So like you should be showing up consistently across every single one of those. So you also start to groom your audience as to what to expect and what to look for when they're hunting and wanting to talk with somebody at your respective brand. That's a quick fire on the presentation. I do want to pause here. I have an example that I can show very quickly in like the 10 minutes, 20 minutes that we have left, as to like what does a MVP of a brand identity system look like that I built for a friend of mine.